The phone buzzed on the marble countertop, its vibrations slicing through the stillness of the kitchen. It was late, too late for casual calls. My stomach clenched as I reached for it, my fingers hesitating before pressing answer. A deep breath. Hello. The voice on the other end was hushed, urgent. A whisper laced with something between warning and desperation. You know what's happening. You have to stop it. My chest tightened. My eyes darted to the darkened hallway, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Who is this? I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then a click. I stood frozen, phone still pressed to my ear, heart hammering against my ribs. And then, as if time had been rewound, I was back 3 months earlier, before the late-night calls, before the tension, before the unspoken truths had started gnawing at the edges of my life. Back when everything still looked perfect from the outside. My husband had just left for another trip, a week-long business meeting in Chicago. It wasn't unusual. He traveled often. So often in fact that our home felt more like a showroom than a place where two people built a life together. I had my routine. Morning coffee on the patio, a workout at the private club, lunch with my best friend who always insisted I needed more excitement in my life. Then errands, dinner for one, and another night in a too-large bed, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, hoping I'd fall asleep before loneliness settled too deeply in my bones. I had everything. A beautiful home, financial security, a husband with a name people respected. So why did I feel like something was missing? I hadn't realized it then, but something had already started shifting. The cracks in my perfectly curated life were widening, even if I wasn't ready to see them yet. And soon there would be no way to ignore them. The house felt different with him there, the air subtly charged in a way I couldn't quite place. I was used to silence, to an empty space filled only with my own footsteps and the quiet hum of a life I had convinced myself was enough. But now there was movement, the occasional sound of his voice in the next room, the presence of another person lingering in the periphery of my solitude. He wasn't a child anymore. He carried himself with an ease that felt unfamiliar, a quiet confidence that made the house seem smaller, more intimate, like I wasn't as alone as I used to be. Our conversations started light, small talk about his classes, his friends, the places he wanted to see. But then they shifted. He asked about my life, my dreams, whether I was happy. It was an unexpected question, one that lingered longer than it should have. At the party, my best friend watched me closely, her gaze sharp as she caught the subtle way my expression changed when he spoke. She didn't say a word, but I knew what she was thinking, and worse, I knew she wasn't wrong. Something had changed and I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. The rain tapped against the windows, a steady rhythm that filled silence between us as we sat across from each other, lost in a conversation that had drifted past the point of casual. It had started with something harmless, a late-night discussion about books, music, the things we never talked about with anyone else. But somewhere between words, the air grew thick, charged with something neither of us had acknowledged before. His eyes held mine longer than they should have, his voice lower, softer, the kind that pulled me in like a tide I wasn't strong enough to fight. My pulse quickened as he leaned in, the space between us collapsing in a breath, and then without thought, without hesitation, it happened. The kiss was brief, electric. A single moment stretched into eternity before reality came crashing down around us. We pulled away at the same time, eyes wide, chests rising and falling in unison, both knowing this had crossed a line we couldn't redraw. He whispered that it was a mistake. I nodded, but the weight of it hung in the air between us. The next day my best friend studied me, her gaze too knowing, sensing the shift I couldn't yet put into words. The moment he walked through the door I knew something was different. His usual distracted energy, the kind that made me feel invisible, was gone, replaced by something heavier, something watchful. His eyes lingered too long, scanning the room like he was looking for something out of place, his questions sharper, probing in ways that made my pulse quicken. I smiled, I laughed at all the right moments, I played my part flawlessly, but inside I was unraveling, every forced breath reminding me how fragile this illusion was. Every second felt like a test, like he could see the shift in me, the weight of a secret pressing against my skin. I was careful, impossibly careful, but then his best friend came over for dinner and suddenly I wasn't the only one under scrutiny. His questions felt casual, but there was an edge to them, a curiosity that didn't belong. He watched me too closely, his interest in our marriage too deliberate, and for the first time, I wondered if I was the only one playing a dangerous game. I sat through the evening, smiling, pretending, knowing deep down that the walls around me were closing in, and I had nowhere to run. His hands felt unfamiliar as they rested on my waist, his lips pressing against mine in a way that should have made me feel something, anything, but all I felt was the weight of what I had done. I kissed him back, forcing my body to remember what once came so naturally, but there was nothing, just a hollow motion, a desperate attempt to claw my way back to the life I was supposed to want. He pulled away, studying me with narrowed eyes, searching for something beneath my carefully crafted expression. I smiled, reassured him, pretended everything was exactly as it had always been, and then he said it. He wanted to take me away, just the two of us, no business, no distractions, a reset. I nodded too quickly, clung to the idea like a lifeline, convincing myself this was my way out, my chance to erase everything before it destroyed me. But later, when I mentioned it at dinner, the glance from across the table was sharp, immediate, unmistakable. But later, when I mentioned it at dinner, the glance from across the table was sharp, immediate, unmistakable. He looked at me like I had betrayed something unspoken, like the idea of me leaving, even with his father, was something he couldn't accept, and for the first time, I realized just how deep I had fallen. Her stare was unrelenting, sharp, cutting through my rehearsed smiles and practiced indifference like a knife. She had always known me too well, seen through the carefully curated version of myself that I presented to the world, but now she was relentless. "Something's off," she said, her voice low, controlled but laced with certainty. I laughed, deflected, reached for my wine as if that could wash away the truth clinging to my skin, but she didn't let up. "Don't lie to me." My pulse hammered, my hands tightening around the glass, and for a split second I considered telling her, spilling everything, letting someone else carry the weight. But I didn't. Instead, I shook my head, assured her she was imagining things, promised myself that if I ended it now, no one would ever have to know. That night, I barely slept, convincing myself I could undo what had already been done, that control was still mine to claim. But in the morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand, and when I looked at the screen, my stomach turned to ice. 3 words. No sender. No explanation. Just a message that shattered every illusion I had left. "I know." My fingers tightened around the phone as I stared at the message, my mind racing through possibilities, faces, moments where I might have slipped. Someone knew, someone had seen, and the weight of that realization pressed down on my chest like a vice. I deleted the message, but the words burned into my mind, refusing to fade. At breakfast, I studied my husband, searching for any sign that he might have sent it, but he was as unreadable as ever, distracted by emails and phone calls, oblivious to the storm unraveling beneath his own roof. But his friend wasn't. He lingered too long in conversation, his eyes calculating, his words carefully chosen. "You seem unsettled lately," he said, watching my reaction. I forced a smile, pretended not to notice the way he leaned in just slightly, the way his tone suggested he already knew the answer to the question he hadn't asked. My hands trembled as I set my coffee down, the illusion of control slipping further from my grasp. Every glance felt like a threat, every word like a trap. The walls were closing in, and no matter how desperately I tried to hold them up, I knew I was losing this game. The house was silent, too silent, the kind of quiet that made every breath feel like a confession. I stood near the window, my back to the door, heart pounding, sensing something was about to happen before it did. And then footsteps. The door swung open with force, the sound slicing through the air, and when I turned, he was there. My husband. His eyes weren't wild, weren't angry, but cold, detached, sharp in a way that told me he already knew. He didn't speak. He just looked. The weight of his stare pressed down on me like 1,000 stones, freezing me in place. Behind me, he was still there too, frozen mid-motion, caught in a moment we could never take back. My husband's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching at his sides as if debating what came next. The silence stretched impossibly long, and then without a word he stepped back, turned and walked out. No yelling. No accusations. Just the sound of the front door clicking shut, a finality that made my stomach drop. He knew. And worse, he wasn't going to fight. He was going to let the weight of it destroy me on its own. The house felt heavier without him in it, every shadow stretching longer, every sound amplified by the emptiness he left behind. He was gone. No calls, no texts, no sign of when, or if he would return. Days passed, each one dragging under the weight of the unknown, and with every hour that slipped by, the tension thickened. His best friend started coming around more often, always watching, always lingering just a little too long, his questions wrapped in forced casualness. "You holding up?" His voice was smooth, but his eyes told another story. He wasn't just asking, he was dissecting, searching for cracks, looking for something he already suspected. I gave him nothing, only polite smiles and short answers, but I could feel the walls tightening, the pressure mounting, the inevitable inching closer. My best friend begged me to leave, to run, to do something before it all collapsed, but I knew it was already too late. I had set something in motion that couldn't be undone, a choice that was unraveling everything I had built. And somewhere out there my husband was waiting, deciding exactly how this was going to end. The message came at dawn, just two simple words on the screen, cold and final. "Tomorrow." Final word. My hands shook as I read it, the weight of what was coming settling deep in my chest like cement. There was no pleading, no threats, no emotion, just the promise of an ending I couldn't escape. The next 24 hours crawled by in agonizing slow motion, each second a countdown to something I couldn't control. When the moment came, I found him waiting in the same place where this life had started. Our home, the one I had once thought was mine. He looked unchanged, the same tailored suit, the same composed expression, but his eyes were different. Emptier, colder, as if whatever once tied us together had been severed completely. "This doesn't have to end like this," I whispered, my voice breaking, but he only smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips that made my stomach twist. "It already has." There were no arguments, no negotiations, just the quiet acknowledgement that I had lost, that nothing I could say would undo what had already been done. He walked past me out the door, and with him everything I had left.